At 2:13 in the morning, Alara Voss walked into Suite 14B carrying a blood pressure cuff, a pen light, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from a 12-hour shift that was supposed to end 3 hours ago. The charge nurse had caught her in the hallway, pressed a patient file into her hands, and said the room was a private case VIP. Cash pay, no questions. Alara was too tired to ask any. She pushed open the door. The first thing she registered was the smell copper and cigarette smoke and something else underneath it, something chemical that her brain filed automatically as gunshot residue before she even understood why she knew that. The second thing she registered was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of a sleeping patient, the held-breath silence of men watching a door. There were 4 of them standing against the walls, all large, all dressed in dark clothing that didn't belong in a hospital, all watching her with the kind of flat professional attention that had nothing to do with medicine. And in the center of the room, beneath a single surgical lamp that someone had angled to illuminate exactly one chair, sat a man. He had his shirt open. There was a wound in his left side, below the ribs not fatal, but serious, the kind of laceration that needed irrigation and suturing and was already showing early signs of infection at the edges. His face was angular and still, the face of a man who had long ago stopped allowing himself expressions that could be read. His eyes were dark and they were on her the moment. She stepped through the door and they stayed on her, and they did not move. Alara recognized him in 3 seconds. Every person in the city recognized Dante Rook. Her hand tightened on the patient file. Her face did not change. "I'm Nurse Voss," she said. "I was told someone needed treatment. If you've ever had someone send you into a room without telling you what was waiting inside, subscribe to this channel right now, because this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Hit like, drop a comment with your city and country so I can see how far this story has already traveled, and stay with us until the end. You do not want to miss what happens next." 3 hours earlier, in the staff break room, on the 7th floor of Hargrove Memorial Hospital, a group of nurses had been laughing. It wasn't the good kind of laughing. It was the kind that has an edge to it, the kind that exists at someone else's expense, and the someone was Alara Voss, who was not in the room, which was exactly why they felt comfortable enough to do it. "She won't even get through the door," said Jenna Croft, who had been at Hargrove for 6 years and considered herself the informal authority on who belonged in the ER and who didn't. "She'll see the guys in the hallway and turn right around." $10 says she cries, said Marcus Webb, pouring himself a 3rd cup of coffee. 20 says she calls security, said the 3rd one, Danny Reese, who was newer than the others, but had been careful from the beginning to align herself with whoever seemed safest to align with. They had forged the patient file themselves. The charge nurse, Sandra Oakes, who owed Jenna a favor she never wanted called in, had logged the suite under a false admission code that would clear the system by morning. The men in the room were real. They'd been there since 9 p.m. and had asked for a medical professional twice, only to be told the attending physician wasn't available. Someone in the hospital's administrative structure had quietly notified Dante Rook's people that care was being arranged. Jenna had simply redirected that arrangement. The plan was to send Alara in blind, watch her fall apart in front of the most dangerous man in the city, and have something to talk about for the next 6 months. It was not a good plan. It was the kind of plan that people make when they have decided that a target is less than them, and have stopped imagining what that target might actually be capable of. Alara Voss had been at Hargrove for 4 months. She was 31 years old, quiet in the way that some people misread as timid. She made few friends. She did her work with a precision that made the senior nurses uncomfortable rather than impressed, the way genuine competence often makes people uncomfortable when it arrives, without the social performance of effort. She never talked about where she came from. She never talked about family. She answered direct questions with answers that were technically complete and revealed nothing. Jenna had decided on the first week that Alara was cold. Marcus had decided she was strange. Danny had simply decided to stay away from her. None of them had asked why Alara Voss, who held a nursing license and 2 additional certifications she had mentioned exactly once, had taken a position at a mid-tier urban hospital doing overnight shifts in the ER. None of them had thought to look at her wrists. The wound needs irrigation and closure, Ilara said, setting the patient file on the tray table and snapping on her gloves. I'll need better lighting and a suture kit. If someone can tell me where the supply cart is, I can be done in 40 minutes. Nobody moved. One of the men near the window heavyset, a jaw like a cinder block, took a half step forward. You're the nurse they sent? I'm the nurse who showed up, Ilara said. If you were expecting someone else, you'll have to take that up with the administrative office. The man in the chair, Dante Rook, who had not spoken since she entered, was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. Not suspicion, not dismissal, something more careful than either. I don't need treatment, he said. His voice was low, flat, the kind of voice that had given up on inflection, because inflection was unnecessary when people listened to you anyway. That's your choice, Ilara said. She didn't look up from where she was reading the wound. But you're showing early signs of infection at the wound margin, which means that in 6 to 8 hours you'll have a fever, and in 12 to 18 hours you'll have a problem that requires a lot more than a suture kit. She picked up a pen light and clicked it on, examining the laceration more closely. So you can let me treat it now, or you can bleed somewhere else. I have patients who actually want to live. The room went very still. The man near the window had stopped moving entirely. The one by the door had shifted his weight in a way that was not comfortable to observe. Dante Rook, who by all available accounts had not been spoken to like that by anyone in recent memory, did not move at all. Then, slowly, something changed in his face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the shadow of an expression, something that had almost forgotten how to happen. Get her the supply cart, he said. The wound was worse than it looked from the door. Ilara irrigated it in silence, working with the systematic efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work before in conditions less controlled than a private hospital suite. The men in the room watched her. She did not watch them back. You're not scared, Dante said. Not a question. I'm focusing, Ilara said. I can be scared later. Most people can't wait that long. Most people haven't learned to schedule their reactions. She reached for the suture kit. This is going to hurt. I'll be as quick as I can, but quick and painless aren't always the same thing. I've had worse. I can tell, she said, and she was not looking at him when she said it, but she felt him go still in a different way, the way a person goes still when they've been understood rather than simply. She worked quickly. The suturing was clean, the kind of work that came from hands that had done it many times, which was a thought she did not let herself complete. When she reached across to check the final closure, her left sleeve pulled back slightly at the wrist. She felt the moment he saw it. The scar was old white and smooth the way scars get when they've had years to settle, and it ran along the underside of her wrist in a line that was not consistent with an accident. Dante Rook looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, then looked at her face. Who taught you to survive like that? He asked quietly. Ilara's hand stopped moving. She held the position for 1 breath, 2, 3, keeping her face completely neutral through the kind of practiced effort that most people would never notice. And Dante Rook, she understood immediately, had already noticed. I don't know what you mean, she said. Yes, you do. She pulled her sleeve down, finished the final knot, and clipped the suture. You're going to want to keep this clean and dry for 72 hours. If the fever comes anyway, get a real physician, not a nurse on a diverted midnight call. She stripped off her gloves and began repacking the kit. Take care of yourself, Mr. Rook. She picked up the patient file, turned toward the door, and walked out. It was only when she was in the elevator, alone, that she let herself exhale. She pressed her back against the elevator wall and stared at the ceiling and breathed through the adrenaline that had been running behind everything she'd done for the last 40 minutes. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when she needed them to be. But her heart was doing something complicated that she didn't have a name for. He'd seen the scar. She had been careful for years. She was always careful. She wore long sleeves. She chose her positioning. She kept her wrists angled. 1 moment of extension across a wound closure, and 4 years of careful disappeared in the space of a breath. The elevator opened. Ilara walked out into the corridor, back toward the ER, and said nothing to anyone for the rest of her shift. Jenna Croft was waiting by the nurse's station when Ilara came back, and the expression on her face when she saw that Ilara was walking calmly and not visibly destroyed, was something that Alara registered and filed away without giving it a reaction. "How'd it go?" Jenna asked, with a brightness that didn't reach her eyes. "Fine," Alara said. "Patient stable. I left care notes in the file." "Patient wasn't scary?" "All patients can be scary," Alara said, pulling up her next chart. "That's why they need a nurse who actually shows up." She could feel Jenna watching her as she walked away. She didn't look back. What Alara did not know, in those first hours after leaving Suite 14B, was that Dante Rook had spent the following 90 minutes doing something he rarely did personally. He had made phone calls. Dante ran his organization the way a careful man runs anything dangerous, through layers, through intermediaries, through a structured system of information that ensured no single point of vulnerability. His lieutenant, Merrick Shaw, handled most of the operational detail. Dante set direction and made final decisions and remained as much as possible a level removed from the daily machinery of what his name had built. There were things Dante did himself, the kind of things where he wanted to be certain that what he learned came directly from the source, without translation. He had a contact inside every major institution in the city, and that night he used 3 of them to pull what could be found about Alara Voss. What he got back was thin, not thin in the way that someone's records are thin when they haven't done much, thin in the way that someone's records are thin when something has been removed. There was a nursing license, current and valid. There were 2 employers prior to Hargrove, a clinic in a city 3 states away, a brief stint at a rural hospital that had since closed. There was an address that checked out. There was a social security number that was real. But before the age of 22, there was almost nothing. No school records beyond a GD, no childhood address, no family connections that could be traced, no online presence that extended past 4 years. Dante sat with that information for a long time. He was not a man who believed in coincidence. He believed in systems, and in the logic of systems, and in the fact that when something didn't fit the logic, there was always a reason, and the reason was always worth finding. He had his people put a quiet watch on Alara Voss before midnight. The next morning, Alara arrived for her shift carrying coffee she'd made at home, because the hospital coffee was reliably terrible. She was 20 minutes early, which was her habit, and she used those 20 minutes to review the overnight logs and check on 2 patients from her previous shift whose conditions she'd been tracking. She was in the middle of reading a chart when Marcus Webb appeared at her elbow. "How'd the VIP go last night?" he asked. His tone was the kind of casual that isn't casual. "Fine," she said, without looking up. "Come on, you can tell us." He didn't. Marcus paused, clearly editing something out. He wasn't what you expected. Alara put the chart down and looked at him. Marcus Webb was 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and had the specific kind of confidence that came from never having been in a situation he couldn't talk or muscle his way out of. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of a person waiting to be told that their prank had landed. "I'm not sure what you expected me to say," Alara said. "Treated a patient. I came back. That's the job." Something flickered in Marcus's face. Uncertainty quickly replaced. "You're tougher than you look, Voss." "Most people are," she said, and picked up the chart again. What she did not say, that she had spent 45 minutes the previous night sitting at her kitchen table, running a name through a private database she still maintained access to through channels she had never officially declared, and that what she had found had not made her feel safer. Dante Rook, 43 years old, born in the city, raised in it, built an organization inside it over 18 years that had its fingers in real estate, waste management, private security, and the kind of informal control over city contracts that never showed up in any court document but was understood by everyone who operated at a certain level. 3 arrests, 0 convictions. A father who died in prison, Vincent Rook, sentenced for racketeering when Dante was 19, and a mother who had died 2 years before that, officially of natural causes. Dante had been running the organizations since he was 22. He had turned a collapsing criminal infrastructure into something that looked, from certain angles, almost legitimate, which was the most dangerous kind. Alara had known who he was before she walked into that room. She had walked in anyway. What she had not expected was the question about the scar. 3 days passed. Alara worked her shifts. She was careful, more careful than usual, and the extra carefulness showed itself only in small ways that nobody around her would have been able to identify. She took different routes between floors. She noted the position of exits. She paid attention to faces in corridors. On the 4th day, she found a card on her locker. It was plain white, unaddressed, unsealed. Inside, in handwriting that was economical and slightly angular, "You left before I could say thank you properly. Da-R," and below that a phone number. Alara stood in the locker room with the card for a long time. Then she put it in her pocket and went to work. She did not call that day, or the next, but she kept the card. What Alara also didn't know, during those careful quiet days, was that the city around her was moving in ways that were about to compress her carefully maintained distance from her own past into something very small. Silas Vey had been Dante Rook's rival for 11 years. He was not a local product. He had moved into the city's criminal infrastructure from outside, taking territory through strategic violence and then securing it through exactly the kind of financial manipulation that was harder to see and harder to prosecute than physical force. He was careful and patient and had, over 11 years, built a machine designed to eventually displace Dante's organization entirely. What Silas Vey needed now was a ledger. The ledger was not metaphorical. It was a physical document, a set of records kept by a man named Gerald Voss, who had been a private accountant working for 3 different criminal organizations in the city 15 years ago, and who had been meticulous enough and terrified enough of what he knew to document everything in a format that was simultaneously comprehensive and, at the time, safely hidden. Gerald Voss had disappeared 14 years ago. He had been officially declared dead 7 years later. But before he disappeared, he had hidden the ledger. And for the last 2 years, through methods that had cost him considerably, Silas Vey had been tracing where it had gone. The trail had led him, eventually, to Hargrove Memorial Hospital. More specifically, it had led him to a nurse named Alara Voss. Merrick Shaw learned about Silas's search on a Wednesday. He sat with the information for a full day before he decided what to do with it, which was how Merrick approached most decisions, not with impulsiveness, but with a specific kind of cold-blooded calculation that had made him useful to Dante for 9 years, and had been, for the last 2, making him useful to someone else. Merrick was 41 years old, trim, with the kind of face that landed just on the pleasant side of forgettable. He had grown up with the organization. He had grown up with the organization, worked his way up through loyalty and genuine competence, and had been Dante's second for long enough that most people in their world considered him loyal by definition. He was not loyal by definition. He was loyal to outcomes. And the outcome he had identified 18 months ago was that Dante Rook was the most significant obstacle between Silas Vey and the position that Silas had offered Merrick if things went the way they were supposed to go. The offer was simple: help Silas dismantle Dante's organization from the inside and inherit what was left. Merrick had said yes. What he had not anticipated was that the accountant's daughter was real, was traceable, and was currently working 12-hour shifts in the ER at Hargrove Memorial Hospital 3 days a week. He went to Jenna Croft on Thursday morning, through an intermediary he used for hospital-adjacent business, and gave her a specific instruction: get the new nurse into Suite 14B tonight, during the window when the VIP patient would be there. Jenna thought it was her own idea. That was the thing about Merrick Shaw. He was very good at making people believe things were their own ideas. On Saturday morning, Alara took her usual route to work, not the direct one, but a loop that added 8 minutes and gave her sightlines in 3 directions, and noticed a car that had been parked across from her building on Thursday and was now parked across from the hospital entrance. Same make, different plates. She went inside without changing her pace. She treated 6 patients in the first 4 hours of her shift: construction worker with a hand laceration, an elderly woman with chest pain that turned out to be musculoskeletal, teenager with a dislocated shoulder who was trying hard not to cry. She gave each of them her full attention, which was one of the things she was genuinely good at, the quality of presence that made patients feel like the only person in the room, which was not performed and had never been trained into her. It had been forged out of something much older and much harder, At noon, she took a 15-minute break and called the number on the card. It rang twice. Nurse Voss, Dante said. You already knew it was me. I had your number added to a specific contact list. That's not creepy at all, she said. A pause. Then unexpectedly, no. I suppose it is. She looked at the wall across from her. What do you want, Mr. Rook? I want to know why your employment record before 2019 is almost completely empty. The break room was quiet. Alara measured the silence carefully, the way she measured everything. I moved around a lot, she said. People who move around leave traces. You don't. I'm a private person. There's private and there's erased. Another pause. I'm not asking to threaten you. I'm asking because I think you came to Hargrove for a reason that has nothing to do with nursing, and I think that reason is something I have a legitimate interest in knowing. You had me investigated, she said. Yes. She appreciated the directness, even if she didn't want to. Came to Hargrove to work as a nurse. That's the truth. Believe you, Dante said. I also think it's not the whole truth. She said nothing. There's a car outside your hospital, he said. A blue Accord. It doesn't belong to my people. Her jaw tightened slightly. I know about the car. Then you know you're being watched by someone who isn't me. I've been watched before, Alara said. I manage. Silas Vey's organization manages differently than you're used to managing. The tone didn't change, it stayed flat, informational, stripped of drama, which somehow made it worse. Be careful today, Nurse Voss. The call ended. Alara put the phone in her pocket and sat for 3 full seconds without moving. Then she stood up, checked her sleeve, and went back to work. At 4 p.m., the hospital alarms went off. Not a fire alarm. The security alarm, a sequence of tones that hospital staff were trained to associate with a different kind of emergency. Alara was in the middle of helping a patient into a wheelchair when the lights in the corridor flickered and the alarm cut through the building, and she looked up toward the ceiling and felt something in her chest go very quiet and very focused. 3 seconds later, she heard the first sound from the lower floors. Not shouting. Worse than shouting, the controlled, deliberate crack of something happening that was not supposed to be happening in a hospital. The patient in the wheelchair grabbed her arm. What is that? An emergency, Alara said. I need you to stay exactly where you are and not move toward any exterior windows. Can you do that? The staying kind, she said and moved. Corridor was already beginning to fill with the specific chaos of a building, full of people who don't know what to do, nurses, frozen at stations, orderlies looking toward exits, a few patients who had heard the sounds from the floors below and were coming out of their rooms with the wrong kind of attention on their faces. Alara moved through it against the direction of the crowd, toward the stairwell, toward the source. She found the first injured person on the 4th floor, landing one of Dante's men. She recognized him from the suite, down with a wound to the upper arm that was serious, but not immediately fatal. She knelt beside him and applied pressure without thinking about whether she should. How many, she said. He looked at her with the unfocused expression of someone trying to maintain consciousness. Came in through the loading dock. 6, maybe 8. Where's your principal? He blinked. The word landed differently than he'd expected it to. 3rd floor, the executive wing. She tore a strip from a supply cart's disposable draping, applied a compression wrap to the arm, told him to keep pressure on it, kept moving. The smoke was coming from the 2nd floor, not a fire. She assessed quickly. A device. Something designed to produce smoke without heat. Something designed to confuse and scatter. Smart. She pulled her shirt up over her nose and moved through it. There were 3 patients trapped in the corridor between the nursing station and the smoke, an elderly man in a gown, a woman in her 40s who was post-surgical and moving slowly, and a teenage boy with both hands bandaged, who was doing the most sensible thing anyone in that corridor was doing, which was stand against the wall and not panicking. Alara reached them, read the situation in 2 seconds, and started moving. You, she said to the teenage boy. Come here. She took his shoulder and repositioned him to the left side of the elderly man. He needs support on his left side. Keep him moving. Keep him low. Follow me. Don't let go. She took the woman's right arm with one hand, steadied her, and began moving all 4 of them toward the east stairwell, the one that was furthest from the smoke. She could hear the sounds from the corridor ahead, not random, structured, the sound of men, who were looking for something specific and had no particular interest in the patients they were moving through to find it. That was the thing about Silas Vay's people. She was learning quickly. They weren't brutal for its own sake. They were brutal in service of an objective, which in some ways was worse. She got the 3 patients to the stairwell door, propped it open, and handed them off to an orderly who was doing exactly what he should have been doing, which was nothing standing frozen in the stairwell, évident with his back against the wall. Get them down 2 flights and out the east exit, she told him. Don't stop. Don't look back. She turned around. The man who stepped out of the supply alcove was holding a radio in one hand. He was big, and he was moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done room clearing before. He looked at her, a nurse, alone, small, in a smoke-filled corridor, and his assessment took approximately half a second. He was wrong about what he was looking at. Alara picked up the crash cart's defibrillator paddles from where the cart had been abandoned in the corridor chaos, and she hit him with them not charged, just as blunt instruments. 2 quick strikes that targeted specific pressure points with a precision that had nothing to do with nursing school. He went down. She put the paddles back. She looked at her hands. They were still steady. Then she heard a voice she recognized from the corridor ahead, and she moved toward it. Dante Rook was standing in the executive corridor with 2 of his remaining men, and the expression on his face when Alara came out of the smoke was the first time she had seen something on him that she could clearly identify. Prize. You need to move, she said. East stairwell. Now. There are men on the east stair. There were, she said. He looked at her for 1 full second. Then he looked at his men. Then he moved. She led them down the east stairwell and out the emergency exit into the parking structure. And they moved quickly and without conversation. And when they reached the second level of the structure where his remaining vehicle was positioned, Dante stopped. He turned and looked at her. The smoke had thinned out here. The alarm was still sounding from the building behind them, and there were sirens now, distant but growing closer. Alara stood in the concrete half-light of the parking structure, with her sleeves pushed up from moving patients, and the fact of what she'd done sitting between them in the air. Dante Rook looked at her wrists, both of them. Then he looked at her face. Alara Voss, he said. That's actually your name? Yes. Voss was your mother's name? She didn't answer immediately. She watched his face, reading it the way she read everything for information, for what was underneath what was being said. The woman who raised me, she said finally. Not my mother. Something moved through his expression. Not the sharp calculation she'd seen from him before. Something older. Something that recognized a shape it had seen before, in different dimensions, in a mirror it no longer looked at. Who was your father? He asked. The sirens were closer now. Alara pulled her sleeve down. She looked at the exit ramp, then back at him. Someone you should probably know about, she said, but not here. And in his eyes, in the space behind the careful professional stillness, she saw the first crack in the architecture of a man who had built walls, specifically because he understood what it meant to need them. He wasn't afraid of what she might tell him. He was afraid it was going to matter. Parking structure smelled like exhaust and old concrete and the specific kind of fear that people leave behind when they move fast through a space without meaning to. Alara stood 6 feet from Dante Rook and watched him process what she had just said with the careful patience of a woman who had learned that giving people time to catch up was sometimes the most strategic thing she could do. His 2 remaining men were positioned near the vehicle, not relaxed, not ready to move, just existing in the particular suspended state of people waiting to be told what the situation was. One of them had a cut above his eyebrow that needed attention. Alara noted it and filed it. Not here, Dante repeated. He said it back to a person repeats something when they're not arguing with it, but they haven't yet decided what to do with it. Then he looked at the exit ramp. The sirens were close now. Police units. She counted at least 3 distinct tones, plus the lower register of ambulances. We have 4 minutes before the structure is sealed. Then you should go, Alara said. And you? I'm a nurse who got caught in an emergency. I have a reason to be here. She met his eyes. You don't. Something passed across his face, not gratitude exactly, but the acknowledgement of a debt, which in his world was probably the closest equivalent. He moved toward the vehicle, then stopped, without turning around. "The man you dropped in the corridor," he said. "How many pressure points does a nurse learn?" Ilara said nothing. Dante got in the car. She walked back toward the hospital entrance with her hands in her pockets and her heart doing the thing it did after situations like that, not racing, just beating with a particular emphasis, like it was reminding her it was still there. The police took statements for 2 hours. Ilara sat in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of coffee she didn't drink and answered questions from a detective named Holt, who was in his mid-50s and had the worn-down patience of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything. That happened in this city approximately a decade ago. She told him what she'd done, the patients she'd moved, the corridor she'd navigated, and she told it in the right order and with the right level of detail, enough to be credible and not enough to be interesting. Holt wrote things down. He looked at her a few times, with an expression that was harder to read than she liked. "You moved 3 patients through a smoke-filled corridor," he said. "Yes, by yourself. There wasn't anyone else available. And the man on the 4th floor, landing with the compression wrap. I found him injured. I stabilized the wound and told him to maintain pressure." She held Holt's gaze steadily. "That's standard emergency response. The wrap was applied with a lot of precision for an improvised dressing. I'm a nurse," she said. "That's what precision is for." Holt looked at her for another 3 seconds, then wrote something down and moved on. She didn't let herself exhale visibly. Jenna Croft was 3 tables away, giving her own statement to a uniformed officer, and Ilara could feel Jenna watching her the same way. She'd felt it every day for 4 months at Sideways, assessing quality. Like Jenna was perpetually trying to fit Ilara into a category that kept refusing to hold her shape. Today there was something else in it, something that looked almost like unease. Good, a part of Ilara thought, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it. She got home at 9:30 p.m. Her apartment was a 2-bedroom on the 6th floor of a building that had been built in the 1970s and renovated badly twice since then, which meant the bones were solid, but nothing was quite. She had chosen it for the bones. She had chosen the 6th floor for sightlines. She had chosen the unit specifically because it had a second exit through the fire escape that accessed a different stairwell than the main one. These were not things a nurse needed to know about an apartment. She locked both locks and checked the window latches, then stood in her kitchen and tried to think clearly. Gerald Voss had been her father. Not by birth, she had known, since she was 9 years old, that the quiet, methodical man who taught her to play chess and insisted on accuracy in everything. The man who checked her homework twice and kept his files in a system so precise. She'd sometimes wondered if he was afraid of disorder, the way other people were afraid of the dark she had known. He wasn't her biological father. He had never hidden it from her. He had simply never discussed it, and she had learned early that some doors were closed, not out of cruelty, but out of the specific kind of pain that made opening them impossible. What Gerald had given her, instead of origin, was preparation. He had taught her to read people the way he read financial documents, looking for inconsistencies, for places where the numbers didn't add up, for the gap between what was declared and what was actual. He had taught her that the most useful kind of intelligence was the kind people didn't know they were sharing. He had taught her that fear was a resource if you could get to the other side of your first reaction. And then he had disappeared. She had been 17. The official story was abandonment, a man under financial and legal pressure who had simply walked away from his family and his responsibilities. The woman who had raised Ilara, Marta Voss, had accepted that story, not because she believed it, but because the alternative required a kind of fight she didn't have left in her. Marta had died 3 years later. Ilara had been alone since she was 20. She had not believed the official story for a single day. Gerald Voss had not been the kind of man who walked away. He had been the kind of man who stayed when staying was dangerous, because he believed that accurate records were the closest thing to justice that most people in his world ever got access to. He had documented everything. She knew that about him the same way she knew it was going to rain before the clouds arrived, not from evidence, but from the specific quality of his character that she had absorbed over 17 years of close observation. He had hidden the ledger somewhere he knew she would eventually look. Question that had taken her years to answer was where. Hargrove Memorial Hospital had been built on land that Gerald Voss had helped manage the financial documentation for 30 years ago, when the original medical foundation that owned the property had been quietly funneling money through a series of shell companies connected to exactly the kind of criminal network that had eventually employed Gerald as their accountant. The hospital was connected to Gerald's work in ways that weren't in any public record. She had found that thread through 2 years of careful research into his professional history, cross-referencing dates and locations and financial filing patterns that most people wouldn't have known how to look for. She believed the ledger was in the hospital. She had been at Hargrove for 4 months and had not found it. And now Silas Vey's people had attacked the hospital, which meant either they knew exactly what she knew, or they were close enough to finding it that the distinction no longer mattered. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands for exactly 30 seconds. Then she sat up and started thinking. Merrick Shaw received the report about the hospital attack at 10 p.m. and spent 11 minutes reading it before he called the man who had coordinated the operation. "How many of ours were taken?" he asked. "None." Silas pulled back before the police arrived. "And the nurse?" A pause. "She's clean." Gave a statement, went home. "She wasn't with Dante when he left the structure?" "No. Separate." Merrick was quiet for a moment. "What about the ledger? Any indication they got to it?" "No. They were searching. But the attack got interrupted before they could complete a sweep." "All right." Merrick set the report down on his desk and looked at it. "We move to the next phase. I want eyes on the nurse around the clock, not ours. Not anything traceable to Dante. Use the external contractors. And Silas? Tell him the ledger is at the hospital. Tell him the nurse knows where it is specifically." Merrick paused. "Tell him she'll be more cooperative if she's not in familiar territory." Call ended. Merrick sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He had been doing this for 18 months, the careful double life of a loyal lieutenant who was not loyal, the performance of trust while the machinery of betrayal ran quietly underneath it. He was good at it. He had always been good at the long game, at holding two versions of reality simultaneously and moving between them without friction. What he had not fully accounted for was Dante. Dante Rook was many things, and most of them were dangerous. But the thing Merrick had underestimated was his speed. When Dante decided something was worth his attention, he moved faster than his deliberate manner suggested. And in the 48 hours since the hospital attack, Dante had become very interested in Alara Voss. That was a problem. Not because Alara was a liability she was, but a manageable one. The problem was that if Dante got to her first, got the full truth from her before Merrick had controlled, what that truth looked like, the ledger became something Dante could use, rather than something Merrick could control. Merrick needed Alara scared enough to cooperate, and isolated enough that cooperation with him looked like her best option. He picked up his phone and sent a single message to Jenna Croft. Alara arrived at work the next morning to find her locker open. Not broken into, opened. The lock was intact, the code entered correctly, and the locker was standing 6 inches ajar in the way it did when someone forgot to fully close it after entering. Except Alara never forgot to fully close it after entering. She stood in front of it for a moment. Her personal effects were undisturbed. Her backup phone a spare. She kept in a case at the back of the locker was still there. She checked it without removing it visibly, confirming it hadn't been touched. What was missing was the card. The plain white card with the handwriting and the phone number. Closed the locker, clicked the lock, and went to her station. Her face was neutral. Her mind was moving quickly. Someone with access to staff areas had gone into her locker and taken only the card, which meant someone knew the card existed and knew it was worth taking, which meant someone had been watching her closely enough to see Dante's man deliver it, or someone had been in communication with whoever arranged for that card to be left. The circle of people who knew Dante had been a patient at Hargrove was small. The circle of people who knew specifically that he had left her a contact was smaller, and the overlap between that circle and people with staff access to the locker room was smaller still. She spent the first 2 hours of her shift doing her job and thinking under it. At 11 a.m., Marcus Webb found a reason to be near her station. He was doing the thing he always did when he wanted information. Pretending to look for something while actually watching her, peripherally. Alara had learned in the first week that Marcus was Jenna's primary antenna, the person Jenna used to gather information without appearing to gather it. Rough day yesterday, Marcus said. Rough for everyone, Alara said. You doing okay? She looked at him directly. Why wouldn't I be? He shifted his weight. I heard you were pretty deep in it, moving patients through the smoke. That's the job. Sure. He picked up a chart, put it down. Someone said they saw you in the parking structure after, talking to people. Alara kept her expression flat and easy. I was trying to find a way out. A lot of people were using the parking structure. Right. Marcus nodded too many times. Right. Yeah. Just checking in, he left. Alara turned back to her station and let herself think about what Marcus being in that conversation meant. Jenna had sent him. Jenna had something specific she wanted to know. And the specific thing Jenna wanted to know was whether Alara had been seen with Dante Rook, which meant Jenna knew Dante had been in the hospital and had known before last night. The prank on Alara's first week, the misdirected patient file, the VIP suite, the deliberate exposure to a dangerous situation suddenly rearranged itself in her mind into a different shape. Called Dante at noon from the hospital roof, which was accessible through a maintenance door she had propped with a supply cart wheel stop on her third day at Hargrove, because the roof had a sight line in 4 directions and no interior surveillance. Someone took the card from my locker, she said when he picked up. When? Last night or early this morning. The lock wasn't forced. A pause. That requires either a copied code or someone with master access. Yes. Is anything else missing? No. Then they wanted the number, not information about you. They wanted to know you had it. His voice was flat and thinking at the same time. What's your read on your coworkers? What's your read on your coworkers? She had to make a decision in that moment about how much to tell him, and she made it the same way. She made most decisions under pressure, quickly and completely, committing to the direction rather than hedging. The nurse who orchestrated the prank that put me in your room, Alara said. Her name is Jenna Croft. She's been running surveillance on me through a colleague since the night I treated you. This morning her colleague specifically asked whether I'd been seen with people in the parking structure. Silence. She knew you were there before the attack, Alara continued. She had to. The suite was arranged too specifically for her to have set that situation up without knowing who the patient was and what his presence would mean. Are you suggesting Jenna Croft has a connection to Silas? I'm suggesting someone gave her a specific instruction about me, and she followed it thinking it was her own idea. She's not smart enough to have developed that situation independently. Alara paused. Someone used her. Who do you think? Someone inside your organization, Alara said. Someone who knew you would be at Hargrove that night and knew a new nurse being misdirected to your room could serve a specific purpose. The silence this time was longer and had a different quality. You could hear him processing it, the specific weight of a man arriving at a conclusion he didn't want. Merrick arranged the original hospital visit, Dante said. It wasn't a question. I don't know his name, Alara said. But yes. Someone close to you arranged for me to be put in front of you. I was positioned. For what purpose? I don't know yet. She looked out across the city from the roof. The sky was gray and close, the kind of day that felt pressurized. But I think it's connected to why Silas Vay's people attacked the hospital yesterday. Tell me about your father, Dante said. Not on this call. When? She thought about the car that was probably still outside the building. She thought about her locker and the missing card. She thought about Gerald Voss, who had taught her that the most dangerous moment was the one where you had to trust someone and you weren't sure yet if they were worth it. Tonight, she said, tell me somewhere that isn't your territory or mine. He gave her an address, a restaurant on the east side that was theoretically neutral ground, owned by a family with no organizational affiliations, that she'd have to verify herself, which she would. He said 8 o'clock. He said, come alone. I was going to anyway, she said, and ended the call. Merrick Shaw learned about the call 40 minutes later. Not the content the phone she'd used was clean. The roof location made interception technically complicated, but the fact of it, through one of the external contractors who had eyes on the hospital. Alara Voss had made a call from the roof at noon. 19 minutes. She had gone back inside and worked her remaining shift without deviation. The fact of a 19-minute call was enough. Merrick sent a message to Silas's coordinator. 2 words, accelerate timeline. The restaurant was called Ferrano's, and it was the kind of place that had been in the same family for 4 years. and showed it not run down, just settled, the way things get when they've stopped trying to be anything other than what they are. Alara arrived 7 minutes early, took a table with a view of both entrances, and ordered water. Dante arrived at 8 exactly. No visible security sit, though she clocked 2 men at the bar who were not drinking the way people drink when they're there for the drinks, filed them, and didn't comment. He sat down across from her. He looked like he hadn't slept, which was something she hadn't seen from him. Before the edges of the controlled stillness slightly frayed, the eyes a degree more direct than usual. "You verified the restaurant," he said. "Of course. What did you find?" "Clean. Third-generation family ownership. Outstanding debts to any organized interests. No connections to Silas or your people that I could trace in 4 hours." She picked up her water. "The family's youngest son has a parking ticket problem. But that's not relevant." Something moved in his face that might have been the beginning of something before he stopped it. "Your father," he said. "Gerald Voss," she said. "He worked as a private accountant for 3 criminal organizations in this city, starting approximately 22 years ago. He kept records of everything. Comprehensive financial documentation of the entire network, the flow of money, the names attached to it, the institutional connections. Police contracts, hospital administration, city officials." She held his gaze. "He was meticulous. He believed the records were insurance." "They weren't," Dante said. "No, they made him a target." She set down the glass. "He disappeared 14 years ago. I was 17. I don't believe he's alive." Dante said nothing. He was watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where he was listening at a level underneath the words, cataloging something. She wasn't saying as much as something she was. "The ledger," he said. "You know where it is." "I know where I think it is." "Hargrove." "Yes." "And Silas Vay's attack yesterday was a search, not random violence. They were looking for specific things in specific locations." She leaned forward slightly. "They haven't found it. If they had, we'd know." "How would we know?" "Because every person whose name is in that ledger would be moving right now," Alara said. "And the city would be a very different place this week." Dante was quiet for a moment. The noise of the restaurant moved around them, other tables, the sound of kitchen activity, someone laughing near the bar. He looked like a man trying to make a decision in a room where the walls were getting closer. "My father is in the ledger," he said. It wasn't a question. "I believe so," Alara said carefully. "Gerald worked with the Rook organization during the period when your father was running it." "Yes." "Which means whatever Gerald documented connects back to the foundation of what you built," she said. "Yes." The silence between them had a physical quality. She watched him absorb it, not with the performance of absorbing a shock, but with the genuine private experience of having a structural assumption of your life revealed as something other than you believed. "You knew this when you walked into my room," he said. "I knew your family name was in Gerald's records. I didn't know what that meant for you specifically, but you came anyway. I needed to be at that hospital," she said. "And you were there. That's the truth." He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them looked away. "The person inside my organization who arranged for you to be positioned in my room," Dante said. "You think they knew about the ledger?" "I think they knew about me," Alara said. "I think someone connected my name to Gerald's work and realized I was at Hargrove looking for something. And I think they decided the most useful thing to do was put me in front of you under controlled circumstances before I found it." "To what end?" "To control what happened when I did." She picked up her water again. Her hand was steady. "Someone wants to be in the room when the ledger surfaces. Mr. Rook. They want to own that moment. And they've been engineering a position to make sure they are." She watched his jaw tighten slightly. Watched him work through the implications of what she was saying, not the surface implications, the deeper ones, the ones that required him to look at the people closest to him with a question he hadn't previously needed to ask. "Merrick," he said quietly. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Dante Rook sat back in his chair and looked at the table for a moment. When he looked up, his face was completely composed again. The wall rebuilt so fast, she almost missed the crack. "How long do you think we have before Silas moves again?" he said. "Days," Alara said. "Not weeks. How long to retrieve it? That depends on whether I can get back into a specific section of the hospital. It's been restricted since the attack." She paused. And whether whoever's watching me gives me the space to do it. He looked at her for a moment. I can create a distraction. No, she said immediately. A distraction draws attention. I need the opposite of attention. She thought for a moment. I need one day. Tomorrow if I can arrange the access. And if Silas moves before tomorrow? Alara set down her glass. Then we have a much shorter conversation, she said. Check came. He paid it without looking at the amount, which was a small detail that she catalogued alongside all the other small details she was assembling about Dante Rook, the ones that complicated the careful professional distance she had been maintaining, the ones that suggested the man behind the organization was something she hadn't fully accounted for in her planning. Stood to leave, and he held the door. And when she walked past him, she said quietly, "Whoever's watching you from your own side, they know we met tonight." "I know," he said. "And that doesn't stop you." "It stops me from being stupid about it," he said. "It doesn't stop me from doing what needs to be done." She walked to her car. She didn't look back. Behind her, in the restaurant, one of the men at the bar picked up his phone. Merrick Shaw was in his office at 11 p. When his secure line rang, he answered it on the second ring. "She met with Dante," the voice said. 2 hours. East Side Restaurant. Merrick was quiet for a moment. "Did we get audio?" "No." "Clean location." He thought about this. The timeline was compressing faster than he had managed it, which meant the controlled outcome he had been engineering was starting to acquire variables he didn't own. "All right," he said. "We move tonight. I want Alara Voss picked up before she can get back into the hospital." He paused. "Not Silas's people. Ours. Make it look like a standard security precaution. Tell her Dante ordered it for her protection. And if she doesn't believe us." Merrick thought about the woman he'd been watching through contractor reports. For 4 days, the roof phone call. The smooth statement to the detective. The way she had moved through the attack with a precision that did not come from nursing school. "She won't believe us," he said. "But by the time she knows the difference, it won't matter." He ended the call and stood at his window and looked at the city. He had been Dante Rook's lieutenant for 9 years. He had been genuinely loyal for 7 of them, which he considered more than most people managed. The transition from loyalty to strategy had happened gradually, the way most important changes happened, not in a single moment of decision, but in the accumulation of smaller ones, each one barely visible, until one day you looked back and you couldn't see the beginning anymore. He had told himself it was pragmatic. He had told himself it was inevitable. He had told himself that Dante was building something that was eventually going to collapse regardless, and that positioning himself to survive the collapse was not betrayal, but intelligence. He had been telling himself these things for 18 months, and they had been getting easier to believe. What had not gotten easier was the specific quality of Dante Rook's trust, the way Dante operated from a baseline assumption of Merrick's loyalty that was so complete it had become structural, load-bearing, the thing the whole working relationship rested on. Merrick stood at the window a moment longer. Then he went to get his coat. The accountant's daughter was going to cooperate, or she was going to find out what happened to people who had something Silas Vey needed and chose the wrong side of that equation. Either way, by morning, the ledger would belong to Merrick Shaw. He was almost to the door when his phone rang again, not the secure line. His personal cell and the name on the screen stopped him. It was Dante. Merrick stared at it for 3 full seconds, the sound of it filling his office. Then he answered. "I need you at the East Warehouse in an hour," Dante said. His voice was completely normal, completely even. "Something's come up that I need your read on." "Of course," Merrick said. "I'll be there." He ended the call and stood still in his office for a moment. In 9 years, Dante Rook had never asked Vic for a meeting at 11 p. m at a secondary location without telling Merrick what it was about. Never once. Merrick Shaw looked at his coat on the chair and at the door and at the phone in his hand and understood, with the cold precision of a man who had built his life on reading situations accurately, that somewhere in the last 12 hours, something had changed. He didn't know what Dante knew. He didn't know how much. But the warehouse was a secondary location, off the main grid, and a man who had just had a 2-hour dinner with the accountant's daughter was asking for Merrick specifically, at midnight, without explanation. Merrick picked up his coat. He had run the numbers on loyalty versus survival for 18 months. He ran them again now. standing in his office, faster than he'd ever run them before, and came out the other side of the calculation, with his hands not quite steady, and the specific knowledge that the window he had been managing carefully for a year and a half had just gotten very, very small. Merrick Shaw drove to the East Warehouse with both hands on the wheel and his mind running calculations the whole way. 9 years. He had given Dante Rook 9 years of genuine work, genuine loyalty, the kind that cost something the late nights, the decisions made in gray areas, so Dante didn't have to make them himself. The relationships maintained, and the problems solved before they ever reached Dante's desk. For 7 of those years, Merrick had believed in what they were building. Not in any abstract sense, he wasn't a man given to abstraction, but in the practical sense of believing that what Dante was constructing was durable, that it would hold, that being close to it was the smartest position a man in his world could occupy. The belief had started eroding 18 months ago, not because of anything Dante did wrong, because of what Dante refused to do, which was grow, which was expand, which was acknowledge that the city was changing, and the organization needed to change with it, or it would eventually be consumed by something that had. Silas Vey had found Merrick at the right moment. Merrick pulled into the warehouse district and killed his headlights 2 blocks out, the way he always did when approaching a secondary location at night, which was a habit so ingrained it was automatic. He sat in the dark for a moment and looked at the building ahead. Lights on inside. 2 vehicles recognized parked at the loading dock. Nothing that looked wrong from the outside. He got out of the car. He got 3 steps toward the entrance before the door opened and Dante stepped out. And the thing that told Merrick everything he needed to know was that Dante was alone. No one at his shoulder, no one flanking the door. Just Dante in the yellow wash of the single external light, looking at Merrick with an expression that was completely composed and completely empty of the warmth that had characterized 9 years of their working relationship. "You drove dark," Dante said. "Habit," Merrick said. "Yeah." Dante held the door. "Come inside." The warehouse interior was mostly cleared. It was a staging location, not a working one, and at this hour it had the particular emptiness of a large space with too much ceiling and not enough activity. 2 of Dante's men were positioned near the far wall, not blocking anything, not visibly armed, just present in the way that men are present when they've been told to be present, and given no further instructions. Merrick stood in the center of the floor and did not walk further into the space than necessary, which was a tactical decision he made without quite being aware of making it. "Tell me about Jenna Croft," Dante said. He stayed near the door. Merrick kept his face neutral. "Who?" "Nurse at Hargrove. She arranged for the prank that sent Alara Voss to my room the night I was treated." Dante's voice was conversational, completely level. Someone gave her the specific instruction to redirect that nurse. Someone who knew I would be there and understood what putting Voss in that room would accomplish. "I don't know that name," Merrick said. "You used a hospital-adjacent intermediary you've used 3 times in the past 2 years. His name is Ferris. He runs errands for us occasionally through the logistics chain." Dante looked at him. He remembered the instruction. He remembered who it came from. The temperature in the room did not change. Merrick's body temperature did. "Dante, I'm not finished." Still level, still conversational. The kind of calm that was worse than anger, that had underneath it the specific quality of something that had already been decided. "The attack on the hospital yesterday. I had my people pull the tactical pattern, the entry points, the timing, the way they moved through the building. It was coordinated with someone who knew our internal security positions where my men were posted, which corridors we'd use for exit." He paused. "That's not information Silas gets from the outside. That's information he gets from someone who knows how we operate." Merrick said nothing. "How long?" Dante asked. The words sat in the air between them. Simple. Direct. Requiring an answer that would end something regardless of what it was. Merrick looked at the 2 men near the far wall. He looked at Dante. He ran the numbers one final time, arrived at the same answer he'd been arriving at for the last 40 minutes in the car, and made the decision that a man makes when he understands the position he's in and decides that partial truth is better than the kind of silence that looked like confession. 18 months, he said. The sound Dante made was not quite anything. It was the sound a person makes when something they suspected becomes real. Not surprise, exactly, not grief, exactly. Something that exists in the space between them, where the body registers impact before the mind has processed the source. 18 months, Dante repeated. It wasn't. Merrick stopped himself, restarted. It started as information. Silas wanted to understand the landscape. I gave him general information, structural overview, nothing operational. And then it became operational. Merrick didn't answer. The hospital attack, Dante said. You gave him the security positions. I gave him a window, Merrick said. I didn't authorize the attack itself. I didn't know he was going to move that fast or that aggressively. You gave him a window to walk armed men through my hospital, Dante said, and for the first time, the level quality of his voice shifted not into volume, into something denser, something that occupied more space. There were patients in that building, Merrick. I know. There were people in there who had nothing to do with any of this, and you gave Silas a window to put armed men through their corridors. I know. Merrick's voice was flat. He had nowhere to put the words. There was no version of this conversation where they landed anywhere useful. I know what I did. Dante looked at him for a long moment. Two men near the wall hadn't moved. The warehouse was very quiet. The ledger, Dante said, you knew about Gerald Voss, and that was where Merrick's control slipped. Not visibly, not in any way that would register to the men across the room, but in the specific micro-expression that Alara Voss would have read immediately, and Dante Rook, who had known Merrick's face for 9 years, read just as fast. You knew who Alara was before the prank, Dante said slowly. You positioned her deliberately. You put her in front of me so that when the ledger surfaced, so that I controlled the moment, Merrick said. Yes, to give it to Silas. To negotiate with it, Merrick said sharply. Not to give it away. To use it as leverage. The ledger has names in it, Dante, names that include your father and mine, and half the institutional structure of this city. Used correctly, it's not a weapon. It's a foundation for something new, something you'd run. Merrick said nothing. Dante turned away. He walked 3 steps toward the center of the warehouse and stopped with his back to Merrick. And for one moment, the stillness of his back was the most specific thing in the room. The stillness of a tense holding something in that is trying very hard to get out. Then he turned back around. Where is she? He said. Merrick's jaw tightened. I sent contractors to pick her up tonight. Before you called me, where? I don't know yet. They were instructed to bring her to a secure. Dante was already moving toward the door. Merrick took a step forward, and one of the men near the wall moved. A single smooth lateral step that placed him between Merrick and the door, without any other drama. Merrick stopped. Dante. His voice came out harder than he intended. Silas gets to her first. Don't, Dante said without turning around. Don't tell me what happens if Silas gets to her. Not right now. He pushed through the door, and it swung shut behind him. And Merrick stood in the warehouse with a man positioned between him and the exit and the full weight of 18 months. Decisions of calculated decisions sitting on his chest like something structural had given way. Alara had been home for 40 minutes when she heard the sound in the hallway. Not footsteps, she was used to footsteps, and the specific rhythm of versus delivery versus something else was something she had calibrated over 4 months of listening. This was the absence of sound where there should have been some. Particular quality of a hallway that had someone in it who was trying not to make noise. She was already in the kitchen, which was where she went when she needed to think, standing at the counter with a glass of water she hadn't drunk. She set it down slowly. She looked at the front door. The lock was good, a deadbolt she had replaced herself the week she moved in. Chain was on. The secondary lock on the window that accessed the fire escape was engaged. She had 4 seconds to make a decision, and she made it by going to the bedroom, not because it was safer, but because it was closer to the fire escape and further from the front door. And she picked up the bag. She kept packed under the bed small, black, a change of clothes, and 3 specific items she had carried since she was 22 and she moved to the window. The fire escape was clear. She was halfway through the window when she heard the front door give, not break, give, the specific soft sound of a professional entry that has a key or a bypass tool and doesn't need to force anything. She went through the window and down the fire escape, 3 flights, fast and quiet, and hit the alley at the bottom moving. She was 2 blocks away when her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered it anyway because the alternative was not knowing. "We're not going to hurt you." A man's voice, carefully even. "Mr. Shaw just wants to talk." "Mr. Shaw just sent people into my apartment," Alara said. She was walking fast, not running. Running attracted attention. "That's not a great opening for a conversation." "It was a precaution. For your safety." "Whose safety?" A pause. "Ms. Voss, the situation has developed in a way that requires." She ended the call. She kept moving. Her mind was sorting options the way it sorted them under pressure rapidly. Without sentimentality, each option stripped down to its actual components, rather than what she wished it was. Couldn't go back to the hospital. She couldn't go to anyone from work. She had no established safe location in this city because she had always operated on the assumption that maintaining one would make her a target, and the irony of that was something she was not going to examine right now. She had one option. She called Dante's number. It rang once. "Where are you?" "East Side. 2 blocks from my building." They were already at my apartment. Merrick sent contractors. He anticipated I'd call the meeting. A pause and she could hear him moving. "Clear?" "For now. There's a diner on Alcott Street, the north side. Maria's. Get there. I'll be 20 minutes, Dante." She said his name for the first time without the professional distance, and she felt it land differently in her own mouth. "Merrick knows about the ledger. He's been positioning me from the beginning." "I know," he said. "I know all of it. Get to the diner." She put the phone away and moved. Marcia's diner had been open since 6 a.m. and would be open until 4 the next morning, which was the kind of hours kept by establishments that understood their neighborhood. Alara took a booth in the back with sight lines to the door and ordered coffee she actually drank this time, because the situation required caffeine more than it required caution about hospital coffee policies. Dante arrived in 19 minutes. He sat down across from her, and he looked like the warehouse had cost him something. The frayed quality from the night before advanced into something more specific, the look of a man who has had to reconfigure a fundamental assumption and hasn't finished doing it yet. "Tell me everything you know about Merrick Shaw and the ledger," he said. So she did. She told him what she hadn't told him at the restaurant, the full picture, the parts she'd been holding back while she assessed whether he could be trusted with them, that Gerald had specifically named 3 organizations in his documentation, that the Rook organization's financial records from 14 years ago were part of the most comprehensive section, that whoever held the ledger held effective leverage over every major power structure in the city law enforcement, city contracts, hospital administration, criminal networks. All of it Dante listened without interrupting. He had a specific quality of listening, not passive-active, the kind that absorbed and sorted and processed in real time. She could see it operating behind his eyes. "My father was in it," he said when she finished. "Yes." "What did he do?" She looked at him. This was the part she had been careful with, the part where what she said next would either open something or close it. Gerald's records show that Vincent Rook was involved in the original financial manipulation of the hospital system, she said carefully. Not as the architect, as a participant. He moved money through the Rook organization's real estate holdings to help establish the shell company structure that allowed the criminal network to control hospital contracts. She paused. He was one of 6 participants. He wasn't the most significant one, but he was in it, yes. Dante looked at the table. His hands were flat, on the surface, which was the first time she had seen him without perfect control of where his hands were. "Who was the architect?" he asked. Alara measured the moment. Gerald's records suggest it was someone named Aldrich Vey. Dante looked up. "Silas Vey's father," Alara said. The silence that followed had a weight that she felt physically. Dante sat back in his chair. His face had gone through 3 distinct expressions in rapid succession, the kind of thing that happened when a person received information that restructured multiple things simultaneously and arrives at something that was not quite any of them. "Silas isn't just trying to control the ledger," Dante said slowly. "He's trying to destroy it, because his father's name is in it as the primary architect." "That's my read," Alara said. "Merrick doesn't know that. Thinks the ledger is leverage. Silas knows it's a death sentence for his family's legacy, and he wants it gone. And Merrick is a tool Silas has been using to get close enough to take it. Yes. Dante was quiet for a moment. Then where is it? Specifically. Alara took a breath. This was the last thing she had been holding. The specific piece of information that once shared could not be unshared. The one that committed her completely to a direction. Gerald worked at the hospital before it was Hargrove, she said. When the original medical foundation owned the building, he had an office in the administrative wing, sub-basement level. The sub-basement was sealed during the 2019 renovation filled in, mostly, but not completely. There's a maintenance access corridor that still runs through the original foundation. She looked at him. Gerald taught me a specific hiding method. Documents in waterproof casing within a structural cavity, marked by a specific configuration of pipe fittings that would look like a maintenance repair to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. You've been looking for that configuration for 4 months, Dante said. Yes. Did you find it? I found the corridor 3 weeks ago, she said. I found what I believe is the correct section of the wall 2 days before the attack. I haven't been able to access it for long enough to retrieve it because the maintenance schedule puts workers in that corridor or on a rotating basis, and I needed a clear window. You have one now, Dante said. The attack disrupted the maintenance schedule. The sub-basement was flagged as a potential security risk, and the routine workers have been pulled pending an inspection that won't happen for another 72 hours. Lara stared at him. How do you know that? Because I have a contact in hospital administration, he said. I had them pull the post-attack schedule 2 hours ago. He met her eyes. I was going to offer you the window regardless of what you told me tonight. Needed to know if you'd take it. She looked at him for a long moment. Tonight? She said. Right now, he said. Before Merrick figures out where you went, and before Silas decides that burning the hospital down is cleaner than searching it. The hospital at 2 in the morning was a different building than the hospital at noon. The ER still ran it always ran, but the administrative corridors were quiet, the maintenance crews absent, the security pattern reduced to 2 guards on rotating paths that Alara had memorized over 4 months of careful observation. She went in through the east entrance, using her employee badge, which still worked, because nobody had thought to flag it, and she moved through the building the way she had learned to move through it, with the specific quality of belonging, the pace and posture of someone who is supposed to be there and knows it. Dante went in a different way through a loading access point his contact had unlocked remotely. She did not watch him go. They had agreed on communication through a single earpiece, as he'd provided, military grade, the kind that existed at the intersection of his world and competence. The sub-basement access was through a utility door on the first floor, behind a set of vending machines that had been pushed against it during the renovation and never moved back because nobody had needed the door since. Alara had spent 20 minutes of her 3rd week at Hargrove moving those machines 6 inches, not enough to notice, enough to clear the door, and had oiled the hinges on her 4th week during a late shift when the corridor was empty. The door opened quietly. The sub-basement was exactly what a sealed sub-basement looked like: concrete and old pipe, and the particular cold of spaces that have been cut off from climate control. She moved with a small flashlight, the beam narrow and directed downward, and she navigated by memory, and the map she had drawn in a notebook and memorized and burned. She found the corridor she needed in 4 minutes. The maintenance access ran along the original foundation wall, and she moved along it until she reached the section she had identified 3 weeks ago, a stretch of pipe fittings that was slightly different from the surrounding work, kind of difference that would register as a previous repair to anyone who looked without knowing what they were seeing. I'm at the location, she said quietly into the earpiece. Clear on my end, Dante's voice, low and even. She found the specific fitting configuration, 2 standard fittings, and one that was oriented 30 degrees off from standard installation, which was Gerald's marker, the one he had shown her once in a different context. In a different city, when she was 15, and he was explaining to her that the safest place to keep something was in plain sight of the people who weren't looking for it. Press the wall behind the fitting configuration. The panel gave not much, an inch, and she got her fingers into the gap and pulled. Cavity behind it was approximately 8 inches deep and 2 feet wide. Inside, sealed in 2 layers of heavy plastic waterproofing, was a document case she recognized. Same manufacturer as the ones Gerald had used for his most sensitive files. Same color. Her hands were not steady for the first time in as long as she could remember. She pulled it out. It was heavier than she expected. Pressed the panel back into place, pocketed the cavity contents, and stood up. "I have it," she said. A pause on the earpiece. "Then get to the east stair. I'm coming to you." She turned and began moving back down the corridor. She was halfway to the access door when the lights came on. Not the dim emergency lighting that had been the only illumination in the sub-basement full lights. A GIS. The overhead fluorescence that activated when the space was occupied, triggered by a motion sensor she had not known existed because the sub-basement had been sealed, and there was no reason for it to have active sensors unless someone had installed them recently. She stopped. From behind her, from the direction of the corridor's far end, came footsteps. Multiple. Moving fast and not trying to be quiet. And then a voice she recognized, not Dante, not anyone from the hospital, the voice from the phone call 2 hours ago, the contractor Merrick had sent to her apartment. "Ms. Voss, don't run. Mr. Shaw just needs a conversation." She calculated the distance to the access door. 40 feet. Footsteps were closer than 40 feet. She ran. She hit the access door at full speed, and it swung open, and she went through it and up the corridor toward the first-floor stairwell. And behind her, she heard the door bang and the footsteps multiply, and the radio chatter of men coordinating through a space they had already mapped. Merrick had been here before her. He had known about the sub-basement. He had known about the sensor. He had waited for her to retrieve the ledger and then moved to take it from her, which was cleaner and smarter than searching for it himself. And the specific intelligence of that made her furious in a way she hadn't expected, not at the situation, but at herself, for not seeing it, for thinking she'd had a window when the window had been a trap. Came out of the stairwell on the first floor and ran directly into Dante. He caught her by the arm, took in her expression, and the document case in her hands in 1 second, and turned toward the stairwell door she'd come through. "How many?" he said. 4 at least. Merrick's contractors. They had the sub's basement prepped sensors. They knew the layout. She was breathing hard, the first time since the hospital attack that she had actually lost her controlled breathing. "He let me retrieve it." Dante's jaw tightened. "He used you to find it." "He used me to find the exact location," she said. "All his searching, all Silas's searching, they couldn't find the specific panel. They needed me to lead them to it." She pulled the document case tighter against her chest. "We have to move. Exit routes. Security pattern puts a guard at the east entrance. In 3 minutes," she said. "West is already compromised. That's how Merrick's people got in. Loading dock. My contact locked that access remotely. Take them time too." The stairwell door burst open. The first man through was fast and large, and running with the specific trajectory of someone who had done building pursuit before. And Dante moved to intercept him in a way that was economical and effective, and told Alara, in approximately 1.5 seconds, something definitive about the gap between who Dante presented himself as and what he was actually capable of. The sick man came through, and Alara was already moving, not toward him, but laterally, toward the supply cart against the corridor wall, and she hit it hard enough to send it rolling into his path, which bought 3 seconds. And in 3 seconds, she was past him and moving toward the loading dock corridor. "Loading dock," she said. "Go," Dante said behind her. She went. The loading dock access was 60 feet down the corridor and around a bend, and she covered it in seconds and pushed through the door into the cold air of the dock. And there was a vehicle idling on the service road beyond the dock gate. One of Dante's, she registered. A man at the wheel who was watching the gate with the specific alertness of someone told to be ready. She jumped the dock gap and hit the service road and moved toward the vehicle. And she heard Dante come through the door behind her. And she heard the dock door bang a 3rd time behind him. She was in the vehicle, and he was in. The vehicle and the driver was already moving before the door was fully closed. The service road curved away from the hospital and onto a secondary street, and then they were moving through the city at the speed of regular traffic. Unremarkable. Just another car at 2 in the morning. Alara sat in the back seat with the document case on her lap, and her hands on top of it, and her heart doing the complicated thing again. the one that reminded her it was still operating. She looked at the case, at the plastic sheeting, at the shape of documents inside it. 14 years. Her father had hidden this 14 years ago, and she had spent the last 4 searching for it, and it was in her hands now, in the back of a car moving through a city that did not know what it contained. And the feeling was not the triumph she had imagined, on the rare occasion she had let herself imagine it. It was something much more specific and much harder to name, the feeling of arriving at a place you have been moving toward for so long that the arriving itself feels like a kind of vertigo, like the ground has changed the rules of how it works. "Are you hurt?" Dante asked. No, he looked at the case. "Is that—" "Yes," she said. He didn't reach for it. He looked at it, and then he looked at her, and something in his face had that quality again, the crack in the architecture, the thing behind the walls. "My father's name is in there," he said. "Yes." "And Silas's father is the architect of everything it documents." "Yes." He looked at the window. The city moved past streetlights, closed storefronts, the ordinary nighttime geography of a place that had no idea what was riding through it. "Merrick will tell Silas we have it," Dante said. "He will," Ilara said, "within the hour." "Which means Silas will move everything he has." "Yes." "We need somewhere to go," Dante said. "Somewhere neither of them can reach." Ilara looked at the document case. She had carried her father's ghost for 14 years, the shape of him, the absence of him, the specific quality of a man who believed in accuracy as a form of justice, and had paid for that belief with everything. She had built her life around the search for this moment, and had told herself that finding the ledger would be an ending, a resolution, the point where the long work was finished. What she understood now, holding it in her hands, was that finding it was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something much more dangerous. Silas Vey was not going to let the ledger reach daylight, and Merrick Shaw was not going to let it leave his reach. And Dante Rook was sitting beside her in the back of a moving car with his father's name, inside the case on her lap, and a choice ahead of him that was going to define everything that came after. And somewhere in the city, in an office or a car or a phone call happening right now, Merrick Shaw was telling Silas Vey that the accountant's daughter had found what they'd been looking for, and that she was with Dante, and that the window for a clean resolution had officially closed. Ilara pressed her hand flat against the case and felt the shape of the documents inside it. "I know somewhere," she said. Place Ilara knew was a decommissioned medical records facility on the outer edge of the hospital district, a squat, 2-story building that had been part of the original Hargrove system before digital records made its function obsolete. She had found it in her second week at the hospital, not because she was looking for a safe house, not because she was looking for a speedplays. She had traced Gerald's professional history through city zoning records and discovered that this building had been part of the same medical foundation that owned the hospital's original land. Gerald had worked here too. She had told no one about it. She had visited it once, on a Sunday afternoon, posing as a contractor, assessing the exterior. For a fictional renovation company, she had created a paper trail specifically to justify the visit. She had noted the entry points, the structural condition, fact that the utilities were still partially connected because the building was in a zoning dispute and neither the city nor the hospital system wanted to pay for complete decommission until the lawyers finished arguing. It was not comfortable. It was not warm. But it had 4 walls and multiple exits, and nobody had any reason to look for them there. The driver got them inside the fence through a service gate that Ilara directed him to from memory, and they came in through a ground-level loading entrance on the building's north face, and when the door shut behind them, the darkness was complete until Dante found a circuit breaker and brought up a single row of emergency lighting that ran along the ceiling in yellow strips. The interior smelled like old paper and concrete dust. Filing cabinets lined the walls, empty now, their drawers hanging open. Ilara set the document case on a steel table in what had been the central processing room and stood over it for a moment. "How long do we have?" Dante said. "Before Merrick tells Silas where we might be." "I don't know." "Merrick doesn't know about this building." She looked around the space. "But Silas has resources I can't fully map, and if he pulls the right records—" "Hours," Dante said. "Not more." "Then we open it now," she said, and she broke the waterproof seal. The ledger was not one document. It was 11. Each one individually waterproofed, labeled in Gerald Voss's precise handwriting with dates and category codes that Elara recognized from the filing system he had used at home, a system she had absorbed by proximity over 17 years without understanding its significance until she started looking for it. Spread them on the table, and Dante stood beside her, and they went through them in silence that was broken only by the occasional sound of pages turning and, once, a sharp exhale from Dante that he didn't try to contain. The financial records were comprehensive in the way that only a meticulous, frightened man's records were comprehensive, the comprehend of the kind of documentation that came from someone who understood they were recording their own potential death sentence alongside everyone else's, and had decided that accuracy mattered more than self-preservation. Vincent Rook's name appeared in 4 documents, not as an architect. Elara had been truthful about that, but as a participant who had moved significant sums through real estate holdings to facilitate the shell company structure. He had known what he was participating in. The records were clear on that. He had asked questions that Gerald had documented verbatim, questions that showed Vincent understood the mechanism and had made a decision to continue. Dante read those sections without expression. His jaw was set. His breathing was even. She watched him from the edge of her vision. And she saw the moment he reached the end of the relevant pages and put them down and didn't pick up another document for 30 seconds. He knew, Dante said. Yes. He started again. Everything I inherited was built on a foundation that included this, Elara said carefully. Yes. Dante looked at the table, at the 11 documents spread across it, at the accumulated evidence of a system that had moved money and influence and control through every institution in the city for 2 decades, and at the center of it, in the oldest documents, the name Aldrich Vey in Gerald's handwriting, annotated with financial flows and decision records, and, in one document, a direct quote from a conversation Gerald had apparently recorded. Aldrich Vey orchestrated the original structure, Elara said. My father believed he was the one who eventually decided Gerald was too dangerous to keep. I think that's why Gerald disappeared. Silas knows his father killed yours, Dante said. She had not said it that way before. The directness of it landed differently when someone else said it harder, more specific, the thing itself rather than the shape around it. Believe so, she said. Dante looked at her. That's why you came. Not just for the ledger. For that. The ledger is the documentation, she said. Without it, it's just a theory. With it, she looked at the papers. With it, it's evidence. Evidence for what? For the federal investigation that's been circling this city's institutional corruption for 4 years without being able to make anything stick, she said. I've been in contact with a federal prosecutor for 8 months, a woman named Cass Aldine. She's been building a case, but she's been missing the financial documentation that would let her connect the institutional players to the criminal ones. Elara straightened. The ledger is that connection. Dante was very still. You've been working with federal prosecutors, he said. Yes, for 8 months. Yes. His eyes moved across her face in the specific way they did when he was reading something that was more complex than it appeared. My name is not in those documents, Lancy says. It was not a question, but it had a question underneath it. Your name is not in those documents, she said. Your father's is. Your organization's financial structures appear in the tracing documentation, but as vehicles, not as primary actors. She held his gaze. You were 19 when this was happening. You inherited what he left. That's different from what he did. Not to everyone. No, she said. Not to everyone. He looked at the documents for a long moment. She let him look. She understood that what he was doing was not just reading, he was recalibrating, restructuring, doing the interior work of a man whose foundational understanding of his own history had just been replaced with something more complicated and more honest. Then his earpiece, he was still wearing it, crackled. The driver's voice, from outside, movement on the south perimeter. 3 vehicles. Both of them moved at the same time. Elara got the documents back into the case in 40 seconds, which was not fast enough, and she knew it, but it was what she had. Dante was already at the window on the building's south face, looking through a gap in the boarded glass at the street below. And what he saw made him step back with an expression that was the first purely unguarded thing she had seen on him. Silas came himself, he said. She came to the window. In the street below, 3 black vehicles had stopped at staggered positions along the fence line, and men were moving out of them with the coordinated efficiency of people who had been briefed on the building's layout in advance. 12, she counted, maybe 14. And stepping out of the center vehicle, unhurried, was a man she had only seen in photographs, lean, silver-haired, the kind of physical composure that came from decades of being the most dangerous person in any room he walked into. Silas Vey looked up at the building with an expression of patience that was more threatening than urgency. "How did he get here this fast?" she said. "He was already moving," Dante said. "He didn't wait for Merrick to call him. He had people watching the hospital after the sub-basement he followed us out. He stepped away from the window. He's been 3 steps behind us the whole night, and I didn't see it." His voice had an edge she hadn't heard before, not panic, but the specific anger of a man who holds himself to a standard of situational awareness and has just discovered he fell short of it. "How many do we have?" she said. 2 inside. The driver outside. He pulled out his phone. "I can get more here in 20 minutes. "We don't have 20 minutes. "No." They looked at each other across the steel table, with the document case between them and the sound of movement beginning at the building's perimeter, and the specific weight of a situation that had compressed itself into a space with very few exits. "The north loading entrance," she said. "The one we came in. It opens onto the service alley that connects to the main street 3 blocks over. They'll have it covered, probably, but it's the longest sight line. Anyone covering it is positioned at distance." She picked up the case. "Can move faster through that alley than a positioned team can reposition. You're not going alone. You need to stay. If Silas walks in here and you're not in the building, he burns it and disappears and we have nothing." She said it plainly, the logic of it overriding the part of her that didn't want to say it. "You're the reason he has to negotiate rather than destroy. He needs to know you're here." Dante looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "Give me the case," he said. "No." "Allah." "The case goes to Aldine," she said. "That was always the plan. That's still the plan." She held the case against her chest. "Keep him talking. Give me 15 minutes. And if I can't keep him talking for 15 minutes, then improvise," she said, and she moved. The north loading entrance was 60 feet of corridor and then a steel door, and she covered it in seconds and hit the door with her shoulder and stepped into the alley and immediately pressed herself against the exterior wall. The alley was dark and long, and it was not empty. The man at the far end was positioned correctly, kneeling, using a dumpster for cover, watching the alley entrance she'd just come through. She had come out below his sight line by going through the door low, and she had approximately 3 seconds before he adjusted. She moved right into the gap between the building's exterior and a stack of old pallets, and stayed low and moved rat-fast along the wall toward the alley's midpoint, where a secondary path cut between 2 adjacent buildings toward the service road. She heard him move, heard the radio click. She was already around the corner into the cut-through before the transmission completed. Cut-through was narrow shoulder width, concrete walls on both sides, and she ran it at full speed and came out onto the service road breathing hard. 1 vehicle was positioned here too, idling, but the driver's attention was on the building. She was coming out behind his rear quarter panel, and she moved across the service road in his blind spot and into the shadow of the opposite building and kept moving. She was a block away before she heard the radio traffic escalate behind her, pulled out her phone and called Cass Aldine. It rang 4 times. It was 3 in the morning. The prosecutor was not waiting by her phone, and then picked up with the specific alert quality of someone who had trained themselves to wake fast. "Voss." "I have the ledger," Alara said. She was still moving, phone pressed to her ear, the case under her other arm. All 11 documents. Complete. A pause that lasted exactly 2 seconds. "Where are you?" "East Side. Medical Records District. I need a secure pickup right now. I have Silas Vey's people within a block. I can have a car there I need it in 8 minutes, or the window closes," Alara said. "I'm at the corner of Harrow and Elms. I'll be there for 8 minutes. 8 minutes, Aldine said. "Stay on the phone." Alara stayed on the phone and walked fast and watched every corner and thought about Dante in the building with Silas Vey and his 14 men and 2 of his own. and she pushed the thought to the side because it was not useful right now, and she would not let herself use the energy of it until she was done. Inside the decommissioned records building, Silas Vey walked in through the south entrance at exactly the moment Dante had calculated he would patient, unhurried, preceded by 4 men who cleared the space in the specific way that men clear spaces when they are confident in their numbers. Dante was standing at the steel table with his 2 men positioned at his flanks, and he watched Silas cross the floor toward him. And he thought about everything he knew about Silas Vey, and about what was in the ledger, and about what Elara had told him about Aldrich Vey, and he let none of it show on his face. Dante, Silas said. He had a voice that was almost pleasant. The kind of voice that sounded like it belonged to someone who enjoyed conversation and had simply ended up in a profession that made genuine conversation rare. Came yourself, Dante said. For this, yes. Silas looked at the table. At the empty surface, his expression did not change, but something shifted behind it, a tightening, very slight, that Dante registered and filed. Where is the nurse? I sent her away, Dante said. With the ledger. The ledger is somewhere safe, Dante said, which is where it needs to be for this conversation to go anywhere useful. Silas tilted his head slightly. The pleasant quality of his expression did not change. What conversation did you have in mind? The one where you tell me why you've spent 2 years engineering access to a document that would destroy your father's legacy, Dante said. And I tell you why that's not going to work. The temperature in the room changed. Not metaphorically, something physical happened in the quality of the air, in the specific stillness that settled over Silas's men and the counter-stillness from Dante's. My father built this city, Silas said, and the pleasant quality was still there. But it was thinner now, like paint over something with a different texture. Your father built the criminal infrastructure that exploited this city's hospitals and police contracts for 20 years, Dante said. Gerald Voss documented every transaction, every name, every dollar. He looked at Silas steadily, including the decision to make Gerald disappear. Silas was quiet for a moment. You've read the ledger, he said. Enough of it. Then you know your father is in it. I know, Dante said. I know what he did, and I know the scale of it, and I know that what I inherited was built on a foundation that included it. He paused. That's not a conversation I wanted to have with myself. I had it anyway. And what conclusion did you reach? That the foundation doesn't obligate me to the structure, Dante said. That what my father did is not something I have to protect. Silas studied him. You'd burn your own organization to expose mine. I'd expose the truth, Dante said. What that does to the organization is a consequence, not the point. That's a very noble position, Silas said, and the pleasant quality had left entirely now, replaced by something that was more accurately the man underneath it. Where's the ledger, Dante? I told you. The word was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of word that occupied all available space through compression rather than volume. And the men behind Silas moved slightly in response to it, a collective shift of weight that was not subtle. Dante's phone buzzed in his pocket. He did not reach for it. He kept his eyes on Silas. You can take this building apart if you want, Dante said. It won't be here. Silas looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at one of his men and gave a signal Dante didn't fully parse before it was already happening. 2 of Silas's men moving fast toward Dante's flanks, not toward Dante himself, but toward his men. And the sound that followed was the specific sound of a situation, transitioning from negotiation to something else. Dante moved. He went left, toward the filing cabinets along the wall, using the movement of Silas's men as a screen. And what he was moving toward was not cover, but the secondary corridor that ran along the east wall of the building toward the upper floor, access a path he had walked when they first arrived, mapping it automatically, because mapping exits was something he did the way other people breathed. He heard Silas say something sharp behind him, heard the acceleration of footsteps, and he went through the corridor door and took the stairs 2 at a time. The upper floor of the building was open, a former document processing area. Rows of empty sorting tables, windows along the south wall that looked down onto the street where Silas's vehicles were parked. Dante went to the window and looked at his phone. The message was from the driver. She's out. Federal pickup confirmed. He exhaled. 1 breath. 2. Then he put the phone away and turned to face the stairwell door, which was already moving. Merrick Shaw arrived at the decommissioned building at 3:47 in the morning, which was 18 minutes after Silas Vay's men had entered it, and 12 minutes after the federal vehicles had confirmed Ilara Voss's location at the corner of Harrow and Elms. He had been following Silas's operation from a careful distance, which was the position he had maintained, throughout never quite inside the action, always close enough to redirect if necessary, which was how he had survived 18 months of playing two sides without being consumed by either. He parked on the north side and sat in the car and looked at the building and thought. The ledger was gone. Federal hands. Which meant Silas's objective was already finished. There was no recovery from federal evidence custody, not for a document of that comprehensiveness. The network it documented would be dismantled. The names in it would be prosecuted. Everything Silas had been working to prevent was already in motion, which meant Silas, in the building right now, was operating on a dead strategy and didn't know it yet, and Dante Rook was in the building with him. Merrick sat with this for 90 seconds, the precise calculation of a man who had been calculating for 18 months, running the numbers on loyalty and survival and outcome, and arriving at a sum that kept changing depending on which values he assigned to which variables. He thought about 9 years, about what had been real in them and what hadn't. He thought about the warehouse, and Dante's voice saying 18 months with that specific quality that was not anger and not grief, but something that existed between them where the two things overlapped. He got out of the car. He went in through the north loading entrance that Ilara had left ajar when she ran, and he moved through the corridor toward the interior of the building. And he was on the ground floor when he heard the sound from upstairs, the particular sound of a confrontation that had moved past the point where conversation was the primary medium. He went up. The upper floor was not large enough for the number of people in it. Dante was at the south window with 2 men from Silas's team between him and the stairwell, and Silas was at the stairwell doorway, with the remaining piece of his expression, the pleasant surface fully gone now, the thing underneath it fully visible, the thing underneath it fully visible, and the thing underneath was the face of a man who had inherited something and spent his whole life defending it and had just understood that the defense had failed. You sent the nurse to federal custody, Silas said. The ledger is with a federal prosecutor, Dante said. Yes. You understand what that means. For you? Yes. Dante looked at him steadily. For me? I know what it means. I made the choice anyway. My father made his own choices, Dante said. I'm making mine. Silas's hands, which had been still at his sides, moved slightly not toward a weapon, but the movement of a man whose body is registering something that his mind hasn't finished processing. He looked at Dante with the specific expression of someone who has run out of positions to take and is standing in the space where the positions used to be. I should have moved on you 2 years ago, Silas said, before Merrick. Probably, Dante said. Merrick told you about our arrangement. Merrick told me enough. Silas looked around the room at his men, at the empty sorting tables, at the windows that showed nothing useful outside them, and he arrived at an assessment that Dante could see him arriving at. The assessment of a man who is counting assets and liabilities, and finding the liabilities have outgrown the column. This isn't finished, Silas said. It is, said a voice from the stairwell doorway. Both of them looked. Merrick Shaw stood in the doorway with his hands visible at his sides, and his face carrying an expression that was the most unguarded thing Dante had ever seen on him. Not guilt, not apology, but the specific look of a man who has made a decision and is standing in the first moment of having made it. Before the consequences have arrived to confirm or deny it. He was looking at Silas. There are federal agents 2 blocks from this building, Merrick said, following the nurse's pickup. They'll be here in minutes. Silas stared at him. You're telling me this? I'm telling everyone in this room, Merrick said, because anyone still in this building when they arrive is going to have a very long conversation that none of us want to have. His eyes moved to Dante, including me. The room absorbed this for 3 seconds. Then it moved. Silas's men responded to the word federal, the way that men in their position always respond to it with the immediate practical calculation of personal exposure, the specific speed of people who have learned that proximity to a lost situation is a liability all its own. 2 of them, were already moving back toward the stairwell. Silas stood still for one more second looking at Dante, at Merrick, at the room, and in that second his face did something that Dante registered, without having words for, something that was the compressed summary of a long story, arriving at an ending that the story had not intended. Then Silas Vey turned and walked down the stairs. The room emptied in 90 seconds. Dante stood at the south window and Merrick stood at the stairwell door, and the building was suddenly, completely quiet, the quiet of a space that has had too much happen in it, too fast, and hasn't caught up yet. "You called them," Dante said. "I told Aldine's office the building location an hour ago," Merrick said. "Before I came here," Dante turned from the window and looked at him. "Why?" he said. Merrick looked back at him, and his face had the quality of a man who has stopped calculating, who has run the numbers so many times that he's arrived at the place on the other side of numbers, where the math doesn't help anymore and the only thing left is the thing underneath it. "Because you would have done the same," Merrick said. "Said. And I know that. I've always known that. I just spent 18 months pretending I didn't." The silence between them had a weight that was different from the silence. Earlier in the night, heavier, more specific, the weight of 9 years of something real, sitting in the same space as 18 months of something that had replaced it. Dante looked at him for a long moment. "They're going to want to talk to you," he said. "I know. Everything you told Silas. Everything you gave him." "I know," Merrick said again. Outside, from the direction of the main street 2 blocks over, came the sound of vehicles moving with a specific kind of urgency, not the urgency of people arriving at an emergency, but the urgency of people arriving at a position they've been moving toward for a long time and have finally reached. Merrick looked at the window. He looked at Dante. His hands were steady at his sides. "I'm not going to run," he said. Dante said nothing. "I know that doesn't fix it," Merrick said. "I know there's no version of the next conversation where that fixes what it is. He stopped. He looked at the floor for a moment, and when he looked back up, his face was as open as Dante had ever seen it, which was not very open, but was more than nothing. "I didn't want to run." The door at the base of the stairs opened. Federal agents came up fast. Identification visible, voices controlled and direct, and the room filled again with people and procedure, and the specific organized energy of authority. Arriving at a scene and beginning the work of understanding what happened in it. Dante put his hands up, where they could be seen, clearly, calmly. Merrick did the same. And outside, 3 blocks away, Alara Voss sat in the back of a federal vehicle, with the document case on her lap, and Cass Aldine across from her, and she watched the building through the vehicle's window, with her hands flat on the case, and her heart doing the complicated thing, and the specific, exhausted understanding that the night was not over yet, but the part she had been preparing for her entire life was finally, irreversibly, done. Aldine looked at the case. "Is it everything you said it was?" Alara looked at the building, at the lights coming on in the upper floor windows, the shape of what was happening inside it. "It's more," she said. Aldine opened the case, and in the yellow interior light of a federal vehicle. At 4 in the morning, Gerald Voss's 14-year-old documentation of a city's institutional corruption spread across the seat between them, and Cass Aldine's expression moved through 3 distinct phases in rapid succession: professional assessment, recognition of scale, and finally the particular stillness of a person who has been handed exactly what they needed and understands immediately what it is going to cost everyone involved to use it. She looked up at Alara. "This is going to take the whole city apart," she said. Alara looked at the building one more time. "I know," she said. The federal building on Garrison Street had a waiting room on the 4th floor that smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee and the specific institutional neutrality of a space designed to make everyone who sat in it feel equally temporary. Alara had been sitting in it for 3 hours when Cass Aldine came out of the inner corridor and sat down across from her with the expression of a woman who had been awake for 22 hours and was running on the specific fuel of a person who has been waiting years for a particular morning to arrive. "Silas Vey is in custody," Aldine said. "Picked up at the airport at 5:40 a.m. He had a private charter booked to a country without an extradition treaty." She paused. "He almost made it." "Almost," Alara said. "His legal team is already filing. Going to be a long process." Aldine looked at her directly. But the ledger is comprehensive enough that the process ends the same way, regardless of how long it takes. The financial documentation alone, the shell company structure, the hospital contracts, that's enough to dismantle the network your father built a case against. She let that sit for a moment. Gerald Voss was a meticulous man. He was, Alara said. Prosecutor's office is going to want a full statement from you. Everything you know about how you found it, the chain of custody, from the point of retrieval, your communication history with my office. Aldine leaned forward slightly. This is the part where it gets complicated and slow and not at all like what happened last night. You ready for that? Alara looked at the waiting room around her, the institutional chairs, the fluorescent ceiling, the door that led back to the corridor, and the corridor that led back to the world outside. She was 31 years old, and she had been preparing for this specific complication and slowness for 4 years. And the honest answer to Aldine's question was that she didn't know what ready felt like anymore, because she had been in a state of preparation for so long that she had forgotten what the alternative was. Yes, she said, I'm ready. Aldine nodded. One more thing. She paused, choosing the next words with the care of a prosecutor who had learned that some information required framing. Dante Rook gave a voluntary statement at 4:45 this morning, unprompted. His attorney wasn't present. Alara looked at her. He disclosed the full history of his organization's financial connection to the network, Aldine said, including his father's role, including the shell company participation. She paused again. He also provided the names of 3 current city officials who have been receiving payments through the structure for the last 8 years. Names that aren't in the ledger. He gave you information the ledger doesn't have, Alara said. He gave us the current layer, Aldine said. The ledger gave us the foundation. Together, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Alara sat with that for a moment. She thought about Dante in the warehouse the night before, reading his father's name in Gerald's handwriting, putting the pages down and not picking up another document for 30 seconds. She thought about the specific quality of silence that had been in that room. What happens to him? She said. That's a complicated question, Aldine said carefully. I know it's complicated, Alara said. What's the answer? Aldine looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman assessing how much of the real answer to give. His organization's financial structures are going to be dismantled. The legitimate assets, and there are legitimate assets. He built real things. Alongside the other things, those are going to be subject to a lengthy legal review. His personal exposure depends on what his cooperation produces and how the evidentiary picture develops. She paused. He's not walking away clean. Nobody in that ledger walks away clean. But he's cooperating. He's cooperating fully, Aldine said, which is not nothing. Alara nodded slowly. She looked at her hands on her lap, both of them, the left wrist visible, the scar that Dante had seen, across a wound closure in a hospital suite that felt like a long time ago now. My father, she said. The official record has him as a man who abandoned his family. Embezzlement charges that were never prosecuted because he disappeared before they could be. She looked up. Can that be corrected? Aldine's expression shifted into something that was both more careful and more human than the professional assessment that had been there before. The charges were connected to the same network he was documenting, she said. They were fabricated to discredit him if he ever surfaced. With the ledger as context, she paused. Yes, we can move to have the record corrected. It won't be fast. But yes. Alara looked at the door. Okay, she said. Let's do the statement. The grand jury process took 4 months. In that time, 11 people were indicted, including 2 sitting city officials, the former director of hospital administration at a network of 4 medical facilities, and 3 individuals connected to the financial structures that Gerald Voss had documented. Silas Vey's legal team was expensive and creative, and bought him exactly as much time as money could buy, against a federal case built on 11 comprehensive documents and the voluntary cooperation of a man who had once run the organization that had moved money through the same structure. Merrick Shaw pleaded guilty to conspiracy and obstruction charges in month 2. His cooperation agreement produced information that closed 3 additional cases Aldine's office had been unable to close for years. His sentencing was 3 years, reduced from 8. When the sentencing was read, Merrick sat in the courtroom, with his hands folded on the table and his face carrying the expression of a man who had finally stopped calculating and was simply present in the room where things were happening to him. Alara was not in the courtroom for Merrick's sentencing. She was at Hargrove Memorial finishing a shift. She had gone back to work 8 days after the night at the decommissioned building, which was 6 days after Aldine's office told her she could resume normal activity, and 2 days after she spent an entire Sunday afternoon sitting in her apartment thinking about whether normal activity was something she still had access to. She had gone back because the patients were real, and the work was real, and the things she had discovered in 4 months of looking for a hidden document inside a hospital was that she was actually good at being a nurse in a way that had nothing to do with the other things she was good at. The day she came back, Jenna Croft was not at the nurse's station. Jenna had been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation into her role in the events surrounding the hospital attack, not criminally implicated, but connected enough through her use as an unwitting intermediary that the hospital's legal department had decided distance was prudent. Marcus Webb was still there, and he looked at Alara when she walked in with an expression that had nothing of the old assessment in it, nothing of the sideways surveillance quality. He looked at her like a person looks at someone they have significantly misjudged, which is a specific kind of look that contains more information than most people want to transmit. "Morning, Voss," he said. "Morning," she said, and went to her station. Danny Reese came to find her at the end of that first shift back, which Alara had not expected. Danny was 27 and had spent 4 months carefully positioned in Jenna's orbit and was now standing in front of Alara in the locker room, with her hands twisted together and the expression of someone about to say something they have rehearsed and are not sure will land correctly. "I didn't know what she was doing," Danny said. "When she sent you to that room, I thought it was just..." She stopped. "I thought it was mean. I didn't think it was dangerous. I should have said something anyway." Alara looked at her. She thought about what to say and decided that the honest version was better than the kind version, even if the line between them was thin. "You're right," she said. "You should have." She pulled her bag from the locker. The fact that it turned out to be more than mean doesn't change, that the mean part was enough reason. Danny's face did something complicated. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay," Alara said. And she meant it as a full stop and a beginning simultaneously, because that was what it was. The hospital itself went through a reckoning that was slower and more institutional than the federal case, but was, in its way, equally structural. The documentary evidence in the ledger connected Hargrove's administrative board to the financial network that had been manipulating hospital contracts for 2 decades. The board was reconstituted. An external audit revealed billing irregularities that had been exploiting vulnerable patients. Elderly patients in particular, the ones with complicated insurance situations and limited family oversight, and the exposure of those irregularities produced a class action that settled 14 months later for an amount significant enough to fund the establishment of a patient advocacy office within the hospital system. Alara was asked to serve on the advisory committee for that office. She said yes. It was not the dramatic version of justice, it was the slow, procedural, committee meeting version, kind that required sitting in rooms with lawyers and administrators and saying the same things repeatedly until the right people wrote them into policy. She was not naturally suited to committee meetings. She said what needed to be said anyway. In the direct way, she said everything, and discovered that directness in a committee meeting had a different kind of impact than directness corridor slower, but with more surface area. Gerald Voss's official record was corrected in month 5. The embezzlement charges fabricated, as Aldine had confirmed, specifically to discredit him, were expunged from the public record and replaced with a notation acknowledging that the charges had been filed fraudulently by individuals who were themselves the subjects of federal prosecution. It was a paragraph in a legal document. It was the smallest possible formal acknowledgement of what a man had done and what had been done to him. Alara sat at her kitchen table the evening she received the official notification and read that paragraph 4 times. Then she put the document down and looked at the window for a while, and the feeling she had was not the relief she had expected. It was something quieter and more specific, the feeling of a door that has been held shut for a long time, finally being allowed to be just a door. Not a barrier, not a weight. Just a door and a wall, ordinary, no longer requiring anything from her. She made herself dinner. She ate it. She went to bed at a reasonable hour, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember. Silas Vay's trial began in month 6 and lasted 11 weeks. The evidence was comprehensive, the prosecution methodical, and Aldine handled it with the specific, relentless patience of a woman who had been building toward this for 4 years and was not going to waste the moment by rushing it. Silas maintained his composure throughout. He was not a man who lost composure publicly, and even at the defense table, listening to 11 documents read into the record piece by piece, he had the quality of someone who has decided that the form of how they face a thing is the only remaining variable they control. He was convicted on 19 counts. When the verdict was read, Alara was in the courtroom gallery. She had not planned to attend the verdict. She had attended 3 days of testimony and then stopped, because the daily exposure to the procedural dismantling of a world she had been living adjacent to for 4 years was doing something to her that she didn't have a clean name for, something that was not quite grief and not quite satisfaction, and exist in the space between them where complicated feelings live when they don't fit the available categories. She attended the verdict because Cass Aldine had called her the night before and said simply, "You should be there." And Alara, who had learned over a lifetime to recognize when someone was telling her something that would matter to her later, had gone. When the jury foreperson read the first count, and Silas Vay's face did not change, Alara looked at her own hands in her lap. The left wrist. The old scar that had started everything, or not started it, been the visible part of something that had started much earlier in a childhood she had spent learning to survive the specific kind of world that Silas Vay's father had helped build. She thought about Gerald, who had believed that accurate records were the closest thing to justice that most people got, who had hidden 11 documents in a wall and trusted that someone who knew how he thought would eventually find them, who had prepared her over 17 years of quiet teaching for exactly the kind of work that finding those documents had required, not the dramatic parts, but the sustained, patient, meticulous parts that looked like ordinary life from these outside. The verdict finished. 19 counts. The courtroom had the specific controlled noise of a large room full of people trying to manage their reactions simultaneously. Alara stood, picked up her bag, and walked out. She found Dante 3 weeks after the verdict, which was not by accident on either side. He was standing outside the hospital on a Tuesday evening, at the end of her shift, not at the main entrance. At the side entrance that led to the parking structure, which was where she came out when she was tired and didn't want to navigate the main lobby. He was in a jacket she hadn't seen before. No visible security, hands in his pockets, and he was looking at the hospital building with the expression of a man who has something to say and is not certain on how to begin it. He looked like he had lost weight, not unhealthily, more like the specific leanness of someone who has put down something heavy they were carrying, and the body is still adjusting to the different distribution. He looked, she thought, like a man who was in the process of becoming something he didn't have a name for yet. "You could have called," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd answer," he said. "I would have answered." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not the complex architecture she had spent weeks learning to read, but something simpler and harder to look at directly. The expression of a person who is standing in a place they have never stood before and is not performing their response to it. "How are you?" he said. She considered the question honestly. "I'm a nurse on a hospital advisory committee who is testifying in a federal proceeding next month and has not had a full night of sleep since early October." She paused. "I'm okay. How are you?" "I'm a man with no organization, 2 attorneys, and a legitimate construction company that is currently under financial review by 3 different federal agencies," he said. He stopped. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite the beginning of a smile. "I'm something. I haven't determined what yet. That's honest," she said. "I'm working on honest," he said. "It's harder than it looks." She looked at him, standing there, no empire, no men flanking him, no weight of authority in the set of his shoulders. Just a man on a sidewalk, outside a hospital, at 6:30 in the evening, trying to figure out what the correct words were. She thought about the night in the warehouse, when he had first read his father's name in Gerald's handwriting, and the specific quality of that 30-second silence. Thought about what it cost a person to look at the foundation of everything they had built and choose the truth over the structure. Your foundation, she said. The medical one. Aldine mentioned it in the asset review summary. He looked at her. She told you about that. She tells me most things at this point. Professional relationship. Alara shifted her bag on her shoulder. You converted the remaining legitimate real estate holdings into a foundation for victims of organized crime. Medical support, legal aid, relocation assistance. Yes, that's a significant amount of money. It was a significant amount of holdings, he said. Most of it was legitimate by the time I was done building what I built. Legitimate money put to what I should have been doing with it from the beginning. He paused. The attorneys are still arguing about exactly which parts qualify as legitimate under the review criteria. Process is slow, she said. Very slow, he said. She almost smiled. They stood in the quiet of the side entrance for a moment. The hospital sounds moved around them, an ambulance in the distance. The low mechanical hum of the building's systems, the ordinary noise of a place that existed to keep people alive, and was doing that continuously, regardless of everything else that happened around it. Scar, Dante said. He was looking at her wrist, which she had not covered today because she had stopped covering it 3 weeks ago, a decision she had made on a Tuesday morning without drama and had simply maintained since then. I want to ask about it. I've wanted to since the first night. I know, she said. You don't have to tell me. I know that too. She looked at the wrist. Scar was old and smooth, and she had carried it since she was 20, the physical record of a period in her life when she had been alone and 20 years old, and had not yet found her way to the specific version of surviving that she was good at. It was not a heroic scar. It was the kind that came from a time before she had the tools she eventually built. I was 20, she said. My mother had died 2 years earlier. Gerald had been gone for 3 years by then. I was completely alone, and I didn't yet know how to be completely alone without it feeling like something terminal. She looked up at him. I figured it out. It took a while. Dante was looking at her, with the open expression, the one she had seen developing across their weeks of crisis and confrontation, the one that showed up when he had stopped performing anything and was simply present in the room. Who taught you to survive like that, he said. Not the question he had asked, in the suite the same words, different weight, different direction. Gerald, she said, eventually, and then myself. She paused. You? My father, he said. And then I had to unlearn most of what he taught me. He looked at the hospital building, still working on that part. How's it going? Slowly, he said. But in the right direction. She looked at him for a moment, at this man, who had chosen to dismantle his own empire rather than protect it, who had walked into a federal office at 4:45 in the morning without his attorney and started talking, who was standing on a sidewalk in a jacket she hadn't seen before, with his hands in his pockets and no one flanking him, and no weight behind his name except the one he was building from scratch. He was not healed. Neither was she. The city around them was in the middle of a slow institutional reckoning that would take years to complete, and both of them were embedded in that process in ways that would not release them quickly or cleanly. There was no version of the next period of their lives that was going to be uncomplicated. She knew all of that. There's a diner on this block, she said. Stays open until midnight. The coffee is better than hospital coffee, which is the minimum bar. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved again, further this time. Yeah, he said. Okay. They walked. The coffee was, in fact, better than hospital coffee, which was a bar so low that clearing it communicated almost nothing. But the booth in the back was the same quality of back booth as Mariah's walls on 2 sides. Sightline to the door, and they sat in it and ordered, and the waitress, who was approximately 70 years old and had the energy of someone who had seen everything and maintained her position on everything, left them alone. Jenna Croft, Dante said. What happened to her? Administrative leave that became a formal resignation, Alara said. She wasn't criminally charged, Aldine's office determined. She was used rather than a willing participant. She genuinely didn't know what Merrick was using her to accomplish. She picked up her call. She thought she was just being mean. She was right about that part. And Marcus Webb, still at Hargrove, he's been different, not transformed. That's not the right word. Just more aware that he doesn't always know what he's looking at. She paused. Probably enough. Dante nodded. He wrapped both hands around his own cup and looked at the table in the way he did when he was thinking under whatever he was saying. Merrick, he said. 3 years, she said, I know. He was quiet for a moment. Thought about going to see him. Have you? I don't know what I'd say. He looked up. 9 years. 7 of them real. I know the math on that, and I know what the last 2 years cost. And I know that the decision he made at the end, the warehouse, calling Aldine, I know that doesn't cancel the 18 months before it. His jaw tightened slightly. It's not nothing. No, she said, it's not nothing. Is there a version of that conversation that makes sense? She considered it. I think there's a version that's honest, she said, which might not make sense and might be painful for both of you and might not produce anything you could call resolution. She paused. But honest tends to be better than the alternative, even when the alternative is cleaner. He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his real one. Not the professional stillness, not the controlled authority, but the face of someone who was paying specific attention to what she was saying, because they had decided it was worth specific attention. Yeah, he said. Okay. They stayed in the booth for 2 hours. They talked about the foundation, the practical shape of it, what it would take to build something real rather than something that looked real from the outside, which was a distinction Dante had been thinking about carefully, and which Alara had specific knowledge about from the patient advocacy work. They talked about Gerald, not everything, but some of it, the chess games, the filing system, the hiding method for important documents that she had learned at 15 and used at 31, and how that particular line between then and now was the kind of thing that was hard to fully absorb, even when you were sitting in the middle of it. They did not talk about what they were to each other, because that was a question that did not yet have a clean answer, and they were both people who had learned not to reach for clean answers when the honest ones were still developing. They were 2 people in a booth, in a diner, who had been through something together that had no real equivalent in either of their lives, and were now in the process of figuring out what that meant from the other side of it. That was enough. That was actually quite a lot. When they stood to leave, the waitress came back with the check and looked at them both with the specific assessment of someone who has spent 40 years watching people sit in diners and has gotten very good at reading what kind of situation they're in. You two going to be all right? She said. Dante looked at Alara. Alara looked at Dante. Working on it, Alara said. The waitress nodded, as if that were the correct answer, which it was, and took the cash Dante left on the table too much. She noted, but didn't say, and went back to the counter. Outside, the city was doing what cities do at 8:30 on a Tuesday, moving, indifferent to individual stories, full of its own business. The hospital was visible from the diner door, the lit windows of it, the ordinary work of it continuing at the same pace it always had. Dante looked at the hospital. So what are you now? Alara said. Question from the version of this she had imagined, in the months when she let herself imagine any of it at all. He thought about it. Not performing the consideration, actually thinking about it, which was something she had come to recognize as a specific quality of how he engaged with questions that mattered. Someone who finally stopped being the man everyone was afraid of, he said. She looked at the hospital, too, at the lit windows, at the building where she had worked for 4 months, looking for something her father had hidden and where she would go back tomorrow, and the day after, not because she had nowhere else to be, but because she had decided it was where she wanted to be. That's a start, she said. Yeah, he said. It is. They stood there for another moment, the 2 of them, in the ordinary light of an ordinary evening, in a city that was slowly and painfully becoming something more honest than what it had been. And neither of them said anything else for a while, because nothing else needed to be said right now. Alara pulled her jacket close against the evening air. The scar on her wrist was visible in the streetlight, old and white and no longer hidden, just a part of her in the same way everything she had been was a part of her. The 17 years with Gerald, the 3 years of alone, the 4 months at Hargrove, the night in the sub-basement with her father's documents, in her hands, the specific quality of arriving at a thing you have been moving toward for so long that arriving itself changes what moving means. She was 31 years old. She had her father's name cleared and his documents in federal custody and her own life, genuinely her own, for the first time since she was 17. She had been asked, once, by a man in a hospital suite with a wound in his side and armed men in the room, who had taught her to survive like that. The answer she understood now was everyone, and no one, Gerald and Marta Voss, and 20 years of hard experience, and the specific choices made in specific moments that had accumulated into a person she could recognize as herself. The answer was that survival was not a thing you were taught entirely. It was a thing you built, piece by piece, in the dark spaces where the building had to happen, and what you ended up with was not a shield, but something more functional, a self that could move through difficult rooms without losing the thread of who it was. She had not lost it. Dante said goodnight. She said goodnight. He walked toward his car, no escort, no flanking men, just a man walking through a parking lot in the dark, his outline diminishing, in the way that ordinary people's outlines diminish when they walk away from you, which was not a small thing. Alara turned and walked back toward the hospital entrance. Not to go in. She was done for the day. Just to look at it for a moment, at what it was. A building full of sick people being taken care of by imperfect people doing their best, which was not a glamorous thing, but was, she had decided, a real one. A thing that mattered in the direct, unglamorous way, that things matter when they are connected to keeping people alive. She stood there for a moment. Then she turned and walked home, through the city that was healing, slowly, the way cities heal, not all at once and not cleanly, but forward, and with the particular stubborn momentum of places that have been through something, that felt in it and have decided to continue regardless. Gerald Voss had believed that accurate records were the closest thing to justice that most people ever got. His daughter had found that the records were only the beginning, that justice was the work that came after the slow, committee meeting, court testimony, patient advocacy work that didn't look like what people meant when they said the word justice, but was in fact what it was made of. She was good at that work. She walked home with her hands in her pockets and her wrist uncovered, and the evening air on her face, and she did not look back. The end.